Good evening, everyone, and welcome to Active Travel Cafe for the 30th of April. I'm Roxanne, your host this evening, and tonight our guest speaker is from WSP, Kristen Layne, and Kristen will be sharing insights into reclaiming the footway, pavement parking in Scotland. And also following Kristen, we've got our regular Ranty Highwayman with the good, the bad, and the interesting. I look forward to finding out what exactly his topic is this evening. I see we've jumped on to sharing slides, but we're not quite ready for that yet. We've got our news session. So if anybody has got a little bit of news that they would like to share, please put up your hand. Or you could wave your real hand around, but I might not see it. So use the hand button. Excellent. Okay, H, you're up first. Would you like to share your news?
Yeah, I had a listening. I think Mark also had a listening on the webinar on micro-mobility. Did lack a little bit on their business plan for success because we've lost a lot of micro-mobility operations in Scotland and in England for that matter. Ride on a pulled back to Spain, Bevagan have gone back to Canada, Circa pulled out of Edinburgh, and even Next Bike have retrenched in various places. The only people who seem to be expanding are Beryl, because they've started in Leeds, I think. And if anybody's got anything on the 200 bikes that seem to have started in Leeds, I'd be interested. Then there was also a road safety webinar with Scottish Road Safety and Road Safety UK about the gig economy riders and monitoring them and managing them. And I think the solution we have in Scotland is we can license operators delivering food, delivering anything in vans and bikes as street trading, the same way as we license bike hire in Scotland. It's street trading. And that way we can tackle the riders of mopeds. We seem to have an absolute rash of guys riding mopeds around Glasgow, electric mopeds that are described to look as bicycles.
Okay, thanks, H. Robin, your news.
Thank you. I've got two things out of many I could tell. So the first is that we had our Oxfordshire Strategic Active Travel Network approved. So I'll take it that you all know what an LC whip is. This is like an LC whip for the whole county. So it's the network that joins up all of the towns and villages in Oxfordshire. This has been under development for about a year with Phil Jones Associates doing the work and with a couple of very good officers in the county, and it's been a very stakeholder inclusive process. And they've come up with a really good report. I'll put a link in the chat to the meeting where it was approved for you to have a look at. And if you're in a county or council with some rural activity, badger your councillors to have one as well. Some background noise.
Yes, and I'm muting that.
Muting somebody. So that's highly recommended. I particularly like it because me and a group of campaigners did an early version in 2017. So this is transporting it into the official realm. And the second one, given that we were all talking about Morris dancing a minute ago, is William Morris's first cycle that he ever made is now on display until December in the Bus Museum, which is also a cycle museum in Hamborough, which can be reached by train. There's a train station there just west of Oxford, and I will post. There's a file. They do a little e-newsletter on a PDF, which I will also stick in the chat. And I think Graham, who's here, has been to see it. So there's a bit of history for you. Of course,
okay, thanks, Robin. I want to make sure we get everyone else's news, so thank you. Ruth, you're up.
Yeah, hi. I don't know if anyone from Harrogate is ever here, but I do a lot of stuff from Harrogate because my sister and husband live there and are very instrumental in lots of cycle work. They've just now decided that on a major scheme that was going to include cycling as a link between Harrogate and Knaresborough train stations, and they've decided not to include cycling because too many people objected, because they're saying if there isn't funding. And Active Travel England have concentrated on improvements for pedestrians, pedestrians, and improvements to the public realm. But they have said that they will come back and probably put in cycle infrastructure. Well, it seems to me that if you're going to all that money and expense and digging up to renew that whole area, and I know it really well, and I'm sure lots of people here may have been to Harrogate, it is a nonsense not to put cycling in there and to allow the anti-cycling rhetoric to win yet again, which, as we know, is costly, and then always ends up with them saying, well, nobody cycles, so there's no point putting anything in there. And Harrogate's got a massive cycling fraternity, and please don't shoot me for that word. Can't think of another one. Thank you.
Ruth.
Very
Sadly,
depressing to me.
A story we hear all too often.
Right.
John, your news.
Hi everyone. Yeah, tomorrow we say goodbye to our dear friend Mike Goff, who was tragically killed just over a month ago when he was knocked off his bicycle in a collision with a motor vehicle. And this morning I actually went to Cambridgeshire County Council's Highways and Transport Committee because 2 days before Mike was killed, Mike posted on his own Facebook page, when will action be taken before more people are killed? And then Mike was then killed. So today I asked that question on behalf of Mike, because obviously Mike can't ask that question any longer. And there was a very respectful response from members of the committee. Obviously, what we now need to do is to see what, fine words turned into action. But I was pleased to get a detailed response, and also they actually answered some of the questions I didn't ask with regards to barriers to active travel, which was quite useful. So I'll be getting a transcript of that answer. So obviously very tragic, very emotional time for myself and many others. But we have promised Mike and his family that we don't want his death just to be another statistic. And just very finally, if anyone is Cambridgeshire based, his funeral 3:30 tomorrow, Cambridge Crematorium, and we'll be carrying out a cycling guard of honour if you are able to join us. Thank you.
Thank you, John. I hope it goes well tomorrow, as well as it can. Yeah. Mark, your news.
Sorry, I had too many screens open at once. Just on the bike share issue, and it'd be good, by the way, I've suggested before if we did a session on bike share, I'm very happy to do a presentation on that at a later date. Just saying that the scheme that we've been working on for ages in Guildford is going to be launched soon by Beryl. We've got our first steering meeting, it's now public, so we've got our first meeting tomorrow. And there's also schemes looking at in other parts, in other small towns. Without going into too many details, because I think we could go on for ages about it, it's interesting to compare what Dave was saying about what's happening elsewhere. I just need to correct what he said. Those companies that he mentioned went bust in their parent countries rather than, it wasn't they pulled out of Britain, they closed down completely, and it was just a penalty for having multinationals operating. But there's a lot going on in the micromobility, shared mobility world, and it'd be good to talk about that in more detail sometime.
Thank you, Mark. Right, well, I'll share a little piece of news. If you're at a loose end on this very sunny bank holiday Monday, Cam Cycle is hosting our annual Reach Ride. So this is a family-friendly, relaxed ride, 15 miles each way from the city of Cambridge to the fair of Reach. You may see penny farthings, unicycles, cargo bikes, electric bikes, tricycles, all sorts of things. And we, on a good day, we could even get up to 1,000 people partaking in this free ride. So if you'd like to come, it's easy to pop up here on the train from London, for example, and I've popped the link in the chat if anyone wants to come and join us. Adam, you've got your hand up, and after Adam, I think we'll get on with our guest speaker.
Yeah, just a quick one. In the west of England, the city region sustainable transport settlements, they're beginning to, the schemes are starting to fall out of that now. We just had one announced for of £15 million. We should be seeing the next corridor scheme hopefully in the next month or so. And then finally the one in Bath city centre. I don't know what's happening on the Bristol side. I think it's much more complicated, probably due to elections that are happening shortly. But yeah, so whereas the Baines one's getting on, and I think South Gloucestershire are also doing some really good work in that space with the city region sustainable stuff. So, but yeah, just in case other regions, other combined authority regions, you should be starting to see also discussions about what the next phase of 2027 to 2032. Those conversations are happening now. We're in 2024 and they're beginning to develop projects and schemes. You should be having those conversations and trying to reach out, use your community groups, reach out to your mayor, your metro mayors, and start trying to develop those schemes and have those conversations now, because in a year's time that it's probably going to be too late.
Thank you, Adam. Timely advice there. And if only our local mayor had appointed a cycling and walking commissioner. We haven't even got that far yet. Okay, right. Shall we? I know that Kirsten was ready to go. So Kirsten, I invite you to screen share again. And I am definitely looking forward to learning from you and being inspired and seeing if we can't kick some of the cars off the pavement in the rest of the UK. Kirsten, over to you.
Hi there. Great. So you should be able to see my screen now. So yeah, I'm Kristen Layne. A little bit about me. No worries, Roxanne. I get the name turned around all the time. So a little bit about me. I work for WSP, one of the big consultancies, but you probably will know my former employer better. I worked for Sustrans for 5 years up here in Scotland. At first with the research and monitoring unit, and then with the National Cycle Network team there, and have a real soft spot for them. I'm still working with them closely, just on the other side of the table. So that's a real soft spot. But here today, I'm actually talking about kind of some projects we've been working on for pedestrians, a bit more than cyclists, although I feel like I'm at home with my people in this meeting today as a keen cyclist myself. So I'm here to talk a bit about some of the footway parking projects that we've been doing in Scotland in response to new policy that's come into law in Scotland over the past couple of years. So you'll see on my screen here a kind of campaign poster that's been rolled out by the Scottish government, specifically in different local authorities, different settlements, and with different versions of the same poster. This one, as you can see, is from Dundee. And it's really timely because enforcement of the new footway parking laws or pavement parking laws began in Dundee in February, as you can see. Edinburgh was the first local authority area to start enforcing it. That happened at the beginning of the year, end of last year, really. And then it's been kind of enforced across Scotland throughout this year and possibly into next. So I did want to say, I had a look at the Twitter page or the X page for the Active Travel Cafe for right before we came on to this call, and was intrigued to see the 3 whole comments that were on the screen there. One about jaw-dropping graphics and an amazing story. I'm not really sure how that was relevant to it, but interesting enough. One from the Ranty Highwayman, who I hear tell is actually live on this call and going to be the next speaker following me, which is really exciting. And then the first one I thought was really interesting, from the Hodson and Hudson fan club, which said Scotland's approach is pretty much just let them park wherever they want, I'm afraid. And so I was kind of curious if the person who posted that happened to be on this call. If you are, feel free to jump up and down. But anyway, I thought that was pretty interesting because actually this is an area where Scotland has taken some policy action and is doing something that's actually legally enforceable, and not just guidance, not just best practice, but actually something that is now actually being enforced. And so I wanted to talk a little bit about that today. So just a bit of that policy context for you. The Transport Scotland Act of 2019 makes it illegal for vehicles to park on pavements and footpaths. That includes footways, that includes something like a greenway that's removed from the carriageway. And it just kind of closes that loophole in the wall where you can't drive on a footway, but you could park there in most of the UK. So that's quite a interesting distinction. Now, it also does establish a permanent exemption process, and that's why we as a consultancy got on board to look at that and look at how that permanent exemption process could work in certain locations. And then, of course, why are we talking about this at an active travel forum? Well, it's hugely, hugely beneficial to pedestrians, particularly those who are disabled or who are using any sort of mobility aid, either for them or for someone else. And I think that one of the key groups that we talk a lot about is parents or other carers with pushchairs, is something that comes up a lot, and I think is really essential. From an active travel space, this is also where we can begin to talk about children on scooters, things like that, as well, who are using the footway as an alternative to the carriageway. So I'm going to talk to you briefly through 3 different projects that we've done in this space in the last year and a half. So the first one was a commission by Council 1. It's Falkirk Council, I'll just tell you that, to audit their A and B roads throughout the local authority. Originally, the commission was to audit all of the roads, but when you actually boil down how many roads there are across an entire local authority area, even a relatively small one, you come up with a very high number. And the second that you say, well, we're actually going to drive or walk or cycle all of those roads, you come up with a very high amount of time. And the problem with working with consultants such as myself is we have the audacity to charge you for that time. And so then you have to kind of simplify it down and say, well, what can we actually look at? And so they decided to look at the A and B roads throughout the area. So we narrowed it down to 110 kilometers of A and B roads across the local authority. And I'll show you what that looked like in practice there, and then how we applied that into other local authorities. So the pilot project for this first local authority took place in 2022. And so that was the kind of first piece of work we did in this space. The legislation, of course, had been passed 3 years prior, but everyone had other things on their mind in 2020 and 2021 that you can appreciate. And by 2022, we realized, oh goodness, they're going to start enforcing this legislation. How do we actually do this, and how do we actually kind of address the implications of this? So we started with a pilot study, which was a representative 10.5 kilometers of route. That's the carriageway length. Of course, the second you get footways involved, there's more, because all of the roads that we were looking at had at least footway on one side, if not 2 sides. And we went from there. So first, we did a desk-based study and identified road characteristics, functionality, and boy, was Google Street View a lifesaver here. It's not perfect, it's got its problems, but certainly it made it really interesting to be able to kind of have a look, familiarize ourselves before we actually went out. Now, this wasn't a particularly active travel-based methodology due to time constraints, although we did use electric vehicles just so that we weren't putting additional pollutants into the air, if that's worth something. So we did a daytime and evening site visit, driving each route twice. And so we were able to record both sides of the road and actually capture in real life what was happening on a typical weeknight and weekday. We did it once at night and once during the day, because of course, some people are away during the day, but then are parked their cars in the evening. And so we wanted to see what was happening there. And then we took that dash cam footage that we collected, compared it with the OS mapping, and recorded 2 major things: the parking behavior, how many wheels were on the footway, if any, and the available carriageway and footway width. And you'll see why that's relevant momentarily. And then, of course, analyzed what we saw and recommended routes forward. For this 10.5 kilometer area, we found 70 vehicles footway parking across 23 locations. So there were quite a few areas where more than one vehicle were parking. It was mainly in residential areas. I don't think that'll surprise many of you. And we recommended a few different options. We said, well, there's room for you to do parallel parking on one side of the street, installing or to install a drop curb and implement footway parking exemptions. And then also we said, we really recommend promoting the use of residential drives, because a lot of the footway parking that was occurring was in front of properties that actually had an empty drive that could house a vehicle. And we thought that there were perhaps concerns about people not wanting to reverse out onto the road. And that, of course, is why when those of us who did take a driving test took it, there was that nifty reverse round a corner maneuver. That's to facilitate movements such as that. So those were the sort of things that we were identifying. Now, you may be wondering, why are you talking about installing drop curbs? Surely that's something more about pedestrian accessibility. Well, that's part of the exemption process that's put in place by the new legislation. So instead of just saying, okay, this area is exempted, and we stick a sign up and we say that's good to go, no police enforcement required, the exemption process is actually quite onerous, because the exemption process requires that there's a meter and a half of available footway space between the parking bay and the rest of the footway. So that's a significant amount. That's enough to allow people to still use the footway. It requires that if you're exempting an area, there has to be a designated bay for parking, so a parallel parking bay, etc. And it requires that there's a dropped curb installed at that location. So that's quite a few different elements that a local authority has to actually action to allow for an exemption to be put in place. And so I'm seeing some shaking heads there when I'm looking at those of you. And so it's an onerous process. And what that actually has done in practice is made local authorities say, well, that makes it quite difficult, really, to put an exemption in place. And it's something that for me is really exciting, because it means that there's a preferential option for the pedestrian and for the users of that footway that are not car drivers. And so I think that's a really positive thing. So the default is very much that the footway space returns to the pedestrian and the active travel user. So that was our kind of first initial pilot project. I'm conscious that took quite a while to talk through, but it gives you an overview of what our approach looked like. We then took that and we rolled it out to the full 110 kilometers across the local authority area. So for those of you keeping track at home, roughly speaking, there were about 100 kilometers left. And so we divided that into 5 sections, utilized the same methodology of recording the route, and made sure that we did that again on representative days, and did it kind of in the early autumn. There's a little bit here about timescales that I won't bore you with, except for the fact that we did the full program in about 7 months. Obviously, this wasn't a full-time thing, but it took about that long to analyze, to review, and to make recommendations. So the overall recommendations for that first local authority were that we found 307 instances of footway parking. In most of them, we recommended maintaining the status quo, not the status quo of footway parking, but the status quo of the road structure. We said, go ahead, enforce the legislation. There's either enough space on the carriageway that people can parallel park, and it'll be fine, or there's enough space in the surrounding road network to absorb those vehicles. So that's fine. Like I said earlier, we encourage the use of residential drives. There were a lot of unused residential drives, and we won't even get into unused garages on this call. It's a whole another ball game. We considered limiting parking to one side of the street to maintain flow. That was particularly in cases where the carriageway width wasn't sufficient to withstand parking on both sides of the street, unless it was footway parking. So we said, okay, let's kind of formalize it to just one side, and that will allow you to maintain your flows. And then in 9 instances, out of all of these locations, 9 of them, we said this is somewhere where we would recommend that you consider widening the footway, installing that drop curb, delineating a parking bay, posting the appropriate signage, and applying for exemption from the Scottish government. And so I think that kind of gives you the scale of when we did an audit like this, actually the number of places where we said this really does need to be exempted, or we think that it does, we're very, very low. In most cases, the footway should be left to the pedestrian. So that's what we did in one local authority. Then we came to another local authority who said, hey, we heard what you did in that first one. And they said, can we do it for us? And we said, well, yeah, of course we can do it for you. And they said, great, here's street view inventory of 12,500 streets in our local authority. Can you just do that then? And we had a look at the inventory, and we realized that about half, just over half of those streets didn't have the information that we would actually need, because what we required was to actually see whether vehicles were parking on the street. We needed to see how wide the road was and how wide the footway was. And we couldn't tell that from the inventory that they had. And so this is a different approach that we took. This is a complicated flow chart. It'll be blurry on your screen. Don't hurt your eyes trying to see it. I'll talk you through it. Basically, what this means is that we, instead of driving all of the A roads and B roads across a larger local authority area, we actually did some desktop-based prioritization. There were two elements that we considered as we kind of looked at this prioritization process. We considered whether or not a route might be eligible for exemption from the footway parking. And so what are the requirements there? Well, to be eligible for exemption, the carriageway needed to be less than 5 meters wide, so that we knew that there was going to be potentially problems with vehicles fitting down the footway if there was parking there, and it needed to have a large footway that could be, some of which could be allocated for footway parking space. And so that was the exemption route. Now, the other thing that we were considering here was, what about the wider road network? Because that's a question that you get asked when you do a piece like this. Well, if you stop people from footway parking here, they're going to go park somewhere. Is that going to impact areas nearby? And so we also considered this wider impacts route on the right here. And so that was for roads that didn't have a footway that was sufficiently large, but the carriageway was also larger. And so that was where we began to consider other options of, are we expecting to see footway parking here already? Are we expecting to see more? And is the displacement likely to have a significant effect? So as we applied this process, basically what it boiled down to was that just under 2,000 streets met the physical criteria, or met the criteria for possible exemption. And then we actually did look back at the inventory that the council already had at this point. And we took streets with existing footway parking where we had instances of that identified. We only looked at streets that were more than 6 meters long. There were some that were kind of arguably more of a drive. And we identified 99 streets that we wanted to review at that point. That's a much more reasonable way to go. We divided those into 15 zones, and I filled out the same performance that we had for the first local authority. So we detailed the road characteristics, the functionality, whether vehicles were 2-wheel, 4-wheel, 3-wheel footway parking, and again, the expected impact of legislation in terms of anticipated displacement. And so those 99 streets, 48, we recommended no exemption, 40 we said exemption, and 11 for potential exemption. So this was a higher rate of the ones that we are actually studying, but of course we boiled down the ones that we were actually reviewing to a much smaller number of the whole. So that was very interesting. And this is just a bit of information about how we calculated displacement, the potential impact for displacement parking, which is really interesting. And that was based on places that were specific attractors, so not necessarily residential areas, but that things that were attracting users in other ways. So we wanted to make sure that we were kind of capturing that. So that was kind of a different element to the work. And then I'm going to tell you about our third study, which is a more shorthand approach. And you see I've got my little animation here. because this was a much lower budget project. Local authority didn't have a lot of information, a lot of time, a lot of budget. But what they did have was really good data from the bin lorries. And what was really neat about this is that at the end of the day, they thought, well, actually, what we're interested in are where would the bin lorries have an issue getting through a road if people move from parking on a footway to parking on the carriageway. And so there were about 40 streets that the council selected for us to survey based on the feedback from those bin lorry operators, where they said, we think that we might have a problem if vehicles quit parking on the footway. And so those streets were then broken into 3 zones for the purpose of the site visits. We produced the performas based on the same methodology that we did previously. And the outcome of this particular project was that we recommended exemption for none of them. We said, actually, where there were issues noted, there is sufficient room. There's sufficient rooms for services, and there's sufficient room for people to use the carriageway and for the footway to be given over to pedestrians. And so I just mentioned that one as kind of an interesting approach that was really different than the flow chart that I showed you on the previous slides, but I thought it was a really great use of using data in kind of a lower budget situation. So those are the 3 scenarios that I just wanted to talk to you about, and I'm sure that we'll move into some interesting discussion now. I think the key takeaways from up here in Scotland, councils have all interpreted the guidance differently in terms of how to enforce it, and they have a different threshold for how they want to apply for exemption to this legislation. We also know that this is not a panacea. It's not going to fix pedestrian issues across Scotland. One of the easiest roads for us to rule out for consideration in our study were the roads that didn't have footways. You can't footway park if there's no footway. But actually, of course, that really highlights issues of connectivity for pedestrians. And that's a topic for this group and for many other groups for another day. A couple of more specific lessons learned for us. Confirm the date of the street view footage you use if you're doing a project like this. I'll spare you some of our lessons learned, but I'll put it this way. If you come to a council with a recommendation and based on street view footage, make sure that there's not a new residential development that's gone up since the street view footage was taken. It can change things a lot, and there's no perfect substitute for actually getting out, seeing the site live. And then finally, the reason I put 3 different projects in one presentation today was just to build a bit on methodology from previous projects. We started out with the local authority asking some really open questions well ahead of the curve, trying to understand the impacts post-COVID of this new legislation. And we were able to use that in a few different local authority contexts. And hopefully it's something that can be useful to you in your relative areas as well. So thank you very much for having me. I've seen lots of questions popping up in the chat, but I'm not quite talented enough to be able to read them as well.
Don't you worry at all. I'll take care of that for you. Thank you.
Perfect.
Thank you so much, Kristen. Really, I think gives us hope is what I would say. It's being done somewhere and maybe complex and took time, but there is hope. Maybe we can get some of those cars off our pavements. I'll take care of some of these questions if you are ready to go. Right.
Ready.
I've got Colin from Ealing would like to know, does vehicles not allowed on footpaths include cycles not allowed to park on footpaths?
That is a really interesting question. And so the way that it's being applied in practice, I'm not saying enforced, but applied in practice is that there needs to be an amount of clear footway. So that kind of 1.5 meters, or in some places 3 meters, is being used broadly to talk about street furniture in general. So things like making sure that there's a clear footway width between buildings and adjacent to buildings is something that's coming up in various other projects that we're doing. In terms of the legislative stance, it's not permissible to ride a cycle on the footway. And that is occasionally enforced. I suspect that's similar everywhere. But yeah, no, it's a good question in terms of parking. And so I can say in practice, there's still an element of kind of try to separate the parking infrastructure from the footway itself, but that's not always the case.
Yeah, it's interesting. We can make all these arrangements to make it suitable to park cars in various ways, but bikes, it just seems to be so much harder to get the infrastructure so that we can get those cycles off the pavements as well. You know, maybe there's a project in that as well. Actually, we've done something similar in Cambridge. Right, question from I'm really curious, has taken all this effort to deal with the helicopter defense for section 72 of the Highways Act 1835, anyway, details, which has made it illegal to drive on a carriage on a footway, drive carriages on footways with cycles being classed as, I'm sorry, this is very, very long. Okay, we're interested about driving on the footway. Do you have any comments on that from the very old legislation?
No, absolutely. So yeah, that reference to the historic legislation is something that we've always kind of been slightly bemused by within our team, within the kind of wider discussion around footway parking, that it has been and continues to be illegal to drive onto the footway. And yet, as a parking location, that's been considered okay, because I'm not really sure how people think that the car is going to get onto the footway if it's not being driven there. You could, in theory, lift it with a crane, I suppose, but I don't think that's what's happening. So yeah, it's a contradiction in the legal system that we've had, and it was, like I said at the beginning of the talk, something that we're really glad that in Scotland and hopefully soon elsewhere, it's that contradiction is being taken out.
Yeah, fair enough. Question from Ruth about promoting the use of residential drives. What rules are in place about cars which overhang the drive onto the pavement? So it seems that some councils allow that to happen, but that is still obstructing the footway. What do you have to say about that?
Yeah, so in the context of this project, we counted wheels. We actually had a discussion about overhanging bonnets, that sort of thing, and we decided that wheels on the ground was what we were going to count. So we did count it as two-wheel footway parking if the front wheels or the back wheels were on the footway. In terms of the legislative position on that, I don't know the answer. I'd be really happy to come back to this group, or if there's anyone who does know, feel free to put it in the chat, but I don't want to speak out of turn.
I do think there was a bit of a response there. It's way up in the chat, so we'll have a look at that.
Great.
Okay, question from Matthew about HGV footway parking. Isn't this something prohibited already for vehicles over 7.5 tons?
So that's an interesting question, which is what everyone says when it's something they didn't know. And I don't know the answer to that. It wouldn't surprise me, but it was still something that we were recording because it was something that we saw plenty of instances of. But I don't know. However, that's a really specific thing for it not to be existent. So yeah, I don't have anything to refute that. But I will say that even if it was the case, it certainly wasn't being enforced in the sites that we were at.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, question from Shane. Who enforces, detects, prosecutes footway parking in Scotland? Police, local authority, or both? And if both, do the police have a different attitude about this compared to the council? It might vary in region as well.
Sure. I mean, I wouldn't want to speak on behalf of all councils or Police Scotland, but yeah, it can be enforced by either. In practice. I think it depends on the kind of standard approach to parking enforcement. in the area. So it's just kind of in this taken in the same lines.
Okay. And a follow-up, I guess, was can this be enforced by civil enforcement officers? So is that how the council's taking care of that?
So that's something that's under discussion, and I think there's a bigger discussion across enforcement of road violations in general. I know that there's been lots of discussion about, dash cams, helmet cams, things like that, and how that all kind of fits together. So it could be, it's still being figured out.
Yeah. Okay. We've got another question. So there's some statistics that suggest that 10% of vehicles parked on the pavement also, or parked really antisocially, have a very high rate, say 10% of expired MOT or other reports. Did any sort of correlation between other forms of, what would we call it? Poor vehicle ownership behaviors correlate with pavement parking?
Yeah, I'd be interested to hear that source of that statistic. That's a really interesting one. It wasn't something that formed part of the research that we did. We weren't running number plates or anything like that, because at the time of the study, it wasn't legislation that was being enforced. So technically, no one was breaking the law here. So I can't speak to that. I would say that in most of the areas where we were seeing this, particularly in residential areas, it seemed like people felt like it was the right thing to do. And so I wouldn't say that people footway parking are inherently, rule breakers, or, some are doing something antisocial intentionally. I think that in many cases, when we see this, it's people thinking that they're getting their car out of the way. They're getting out of the way of other vehicles. And they're either not thinking about or not aware of the kind of implications on pedestrians. And so I think that there's a big kind of cultural behavior change element to this. I don't think people are doing this because they're trying to get in pedestrians' way. I think they're actually doing it to try to be a good citizen, a good resident, and get out of the way of other drivers. And so it's about kind of trying to normalize the transport hierarchy in a way that actually connects with people. But I don't think that people doing this are inherently doing it to be antisocial.
Yeah. Excellent. I think we are probably getting towards the end of our time, but I'm going to take the prerogative to ask one of my questions, which follows on from this one. What have been the community reactions? What has it been like for local councillors during this time? Has there been any strong backlash, or are things going fairly smoothly with this change?
So I think what's been actually surprising is how little fanfare there's been about it. So, there was kind of some big stories, some big campaigns that's going to be enforced. And then nothing much. And that's actually been really nice to hear, to see in practice. Cities haven't shut down, settlements haven't shut down. It's been lovely to see kind of the campaign being advertised on bus shelters and in other locations, billboards, etc., to say, actually, hey, this practice is problematic. Here's why it's now illegal. And actually, from what I've seen, there hasn't been a big backlash. I'm sure that there'll be isolated instances. And I'm sure that if we all had a quick Google, we could find some to pop into the chat. But certainly, from the discussions that we've been having within our team, within the wider sector, it hasn't been something that's been horribly controversial.
Yeah, the world didn't end. There's
No.
make change happen. Yeah, amazing. Well, that is a nice positive note to end on. Kristen, thank you so much for coming and speaking with us today, and thank you for the hard work you've done on this project as well. Thank you for joining us.
Great. Well, thank you for having me.
Yeah. Brilliant. Okay, shall we get on with phase 2 of Active Travel Cafe today? And Mark, also keen off the mark, ready to bring us the good, the bad, and the interesting. Mark, over to you. What are you talking about today?
It was not planned, but I'm talking about footways and vehicles. So let's dive straight in. I'm probably not going to get into the legal niceties here. This is more the practical thing. But for those who are talking just before, in terms of enforcement of overhanging vehicles, Section 137, the Highways Act 1980 is what most authorities would use. You really need to have a local authority policy in place on how you're going to enforce that overhanging. And you have to end up in the magistrate's court. So it's not as easy as walking along and slapping a ticket on the vehicle if it's just an overhanging body and not the tyres actually on the footway itself, which is a footway parking offence. Like the footway parking ban in Scotland, people are saying, well, there's old legislation that we can use and everything else. Personally, it's the kind of thing that if you clarify legislation and somebody can go down there and slap a ticket on, it's a lot easier. So yeah, Scotland could have done it a different way. They've gone ahead with a ban. It's a lot easier to manage. So let's park that, of course, and let's move on. So 2 things to consider tonight. And I think people tend to forget that motor vehicles have engines, they've got gears, you can drive them over stuff. As we've said, people are bumping up onto the footway here. It's quite easy, it's not a problem. However, those walking, wheeling and cycling have energy and they deplete it as they move. Even if you've been assisted by electric motor, and that could be you're being fully assisted, it still takes energy to move around, as we'll find out in just a second with this particular subject. So why do we keep seeing this? The areas there in red are a slope, so drivers can get from the road up onto the parking space here. Nobody overhanging here, which makes a change. The yellow areas are kind of where the slope ramps down to the red bit for the vehicles and back up again. So as somebody walking or wheeling along this kind of environment, it's pretty horrendous unless you can kind of get yourself right at the very back there. You've got this roller coaster effect, really uncomfortable for many people, very energy sapping for others. Why do we keep doing this? These vehicles have nice big engines, they can bounce over stuff, it's not a problem. So let's go and have a look at a bit of guidance here. And this is guidance that has been around for a long time, updated a couple of years back. And I'll give you the reference in just a second. So we're talking about crossfalls. If I just go back up one, crossfall is from, say, the back of the footway here to the front. Sometimes it goes backwards, it goes towards the properties, but generally out towards the front. So that's what crossfall means. It's the gradient across the direction we're walking here or wheeling. So we need a bit of a crossfall for drainage. But if it's too steep, we get like these undulating footway environments. Difficult for wheelchair users and other people with mobility or balance impairments. For drainage, we're looking at maybe 1 in 50, with 1 in 40 being the maximum slope. I'll say 1 in 50 to local authority people and contractors. They'll be horrified because that takes an awful lot of skill to lay. If you're doing it in asphalt, you probably want to get machine in to do that. But here we go. This is what the guidance is saying. And then these, the crazy variable crossfalls are a big problem for wheelchair users. If you're using a mobility scooter, it's going to be tipping you over a lot as you go along. The bold on that final point there is my emphasis. So local authorities or highway authorities, they're the ones that are putting the vehicle crossovers in. They should really be having a policy in place on how they're going to arrange front garden parking and off-street parking, call it what you want. And they need to take into account these whole issues of gradients and levels and everything else. This is not what I'm saying. This is what the Department for Transport is saying in Inclusive Mobility. 2021 was the last revision. This basic stuff has been around for a very, very long time in the previous iterations. So let's look at some of the practical stuff because that's more interesting than the guidance. So what I have here is kind of going back to that first slide, the red area, the steepest area here. I've got a fairly standard, straightforward, what we often see at driveways. So a little bit of a curb up stand there, 30 millimeters. This is all in meters for ease of calculation. We've got about a 100 millimeters difference between the back of the footway here down to that drop curb, and that's giving you a 1 in 18 crossfall, or 5.6% for those that like percentages, and that's based on a standard 1.8 meter wide footway, there or thereabouts. This is what we're talking about: 1 in 18, maybe 1 in 20. So the guidance is telling us we should be doing 1 in 40, 1 in 50 crossfalls. So this is a hell of a lot steeper. This is what it looks like on plan from the very old sketch I did, but potentially you're going along at 1 in 50, all of a sudden you've been tipped over at 1 in 18, then you're going back up again. So it's tiring, it's awkward, it's unpleasant to move along. If we go and look at how that affects the force of somebody, so if you're on a flat surface, the force of gravity is acting downwards. As soon as you tip somebody up, the force of gravity also acts to pull you across. So from a wheelchair's user point of view, as you're wheeling down a really steep gradient, what's happening is gravities tend to pulling you to the lowest point towards the road. So as you're going along, you have to counteract that, and that can be quite tiring. That is as far as I'm going to go with the physics. You can go and work all this stuff out if you really, really want to. The fact is, you're being pulled towards the road. That's tiring. So if we actually go and follow the guidance in inclusive mobility, maybe what we can do in this 1.8 meter wide footway is we can keep the back meter flat and ramp the front down, because again, we're talking about cars. They've got engines, they've got gears, they can cope with this. This is much, much more comfortable for people to traverse. If we go back to the previous presentation, talking about maybe 1.5 meters kept clear of parked vehicles, the further across we go with this nice flat area, the steeper the front becomes, which is fine. Cars can get over it. This is in plan. We're keeping the back part of the footway nice and flat, that 1 in 50, and we're making the front steep because vehicles can go up steep ramps. Probably a bit wider than that, but here's an old piece of footway. The back edge of the footway here, where I'm pointing where the old flags are, that's nice and flat. The bit at the front where the grass is here, that's a bit that's sloped down. One way of doing it. Again, just another bit of a contrasting view of what it might look like. So the traditional approach, in inverted commas, where so many people are doing it, this horrible slope, compared with the front here, the grey area is the slopey bit, the pink area can be used. We can go even better than that. So we can go out, again, this is using my 1.8 meter footway example. I've got about a 300 millimeter curb unit at the front here, and that's very, very steep. It's fine for cars. And what we've done now is maximized pretty much using standard materials. Footway here, it's nice and level, very gentle. It's not going to drag the person into the road. In plan, here's some really old traditional curb units, quadrants or cheeses, as some might call them, big lumps of concrete curb. And then the old-fashioned way of doing it would be to put a pair of those in as shown, and then just ramp the front up here out of concrete. And you can go back, 1930s, they were everywhere. This is what we used to do. Over 25 years ago, when I was a maintenance engineer, that's what I did. It's, you know, we've kind of lost the art of keeping things nice and flat. And here's what they look like. So it's really only the bit at the front that we're sloping off. And here we go. Here's an example. This is an estate from, I think this is probably 1930s vintage, there or thereabouts. So made from granite, big ones these, but they've ramped the very, very front of the path across, and the back of the path, it's a bit old, it's a bit tatty, but it's reasonably flat for those going across. Another example, me getting down on my knees. There's the very flat piece in concrete here, and it's only the very front that's dropped down at the front. No problem at all for drivers to go across that. If you want to go a bit modern, I think this is from Southend on Seafront actually, where they're accessing, in this case, a loading bay. that's used part of the day. But again, very, very steep slope in the curb itself. So this stuff is not difficult. It's basic. It's easy to do. Why aren't highway authorities doing it everywhere as routine? Fantastic. We can go beyond this. And let's look at some old friends here. So here's a raised table, speed hump in a side road, call it what you like. We've kept the footway through here nice and level in terms of gradients, and we're sloping the front off. So we can do this for junctions and side streets. Why can't we do this for driveways in residential areas or whatever? And of course, we've now got in the UK our entrance curbs. We've made the footways. In this case, it's a bit of shared use area through the cycle track that goes off under that bridge there. But we've got the ramp curbs. So we have the cars making the effort. Literally the cars. It's not the driver making the effort. It's the cars making the effort. And people walking, wheeling, and cycling get the nice flat space. So anybody from a highways department on tonight, you're challenged to go back and look at your policies and to go and speak to whoever looks after maintenance and put in crossovers. Why on earth aren't we making the back part of it flat and just sloping the front off? There you go. It's a pet peeve of mine. I'm going to stop sharing
Thank
there.
you, Mark. I imagine all of us share this pet peeve. I hate it so much. I've actually find myself walking on the road. I'm fully able, and I find it so incredibly uncomfortable to walk on a slope.
Yeah, definitely.
I end up on the road, but at least I know I can jump back onto the pavement if a car comes. Other people don't have that option. It's not that easy. So it makes me really mad. There's some questions here, and it sort of aligns with mine, if you've got time for some questions. So I'm actually going to have to do some work out the front of my house, and I'm wondering if I could be really sneaky and do my own sensible curb and driveway arrangement just to prove a point. That's me as an individual, but we've got a question here about a high street footway being relayed, and the officers won't countenance correcting the ramping you have described to, for instance, Dutch curbs. So do you have any advice for compelling the local authority or enabling an individual to rectify this shocking situation?
So from the individual point of view, in theory, you could go and get yourself a license. You'd pay a lot of money in insurance and do the work yourself. So I think
pay someone to do the work, but I would get it done.
Yeah, I mean, practically there are, or there have been local authorities that would license contractors to do it for households. Very, very rare. And in some cases, always whiffs of corruption as well. But that's a whole different story for the pub from years and years ago. I mean, really, local authorities, they will go and market out their own term contractor, or internal works department will do it. So yeah, you probably can't force them to do a proper job. They've got to want to do a proper job in the first place. It's a really good question about having a footway relayed. I mean, in terms of the council putting in a drop curb for an individual now, there's absolutely no reason why they shouldn't be doing it properly, as I've suggested. No reason at all. That's new work. If it's maintenance work and they're going through and they're going to relay all the curbs and relay all the surfacing, the paving, whatever, again, there's no reason why they can't go through and correct it. So a major piece of maintenance work costs a lot of money. Presumably the people dealing with it know what they're talking about. They're there as council officers running stuff. And they've got the Equality Act 2010. And what the Equality Act tells us is if you're a transport provider, you can make reasonable adjustments to your transport offer. Going down the entire footway and digging it up and relaying it, that to me, a reasonable adjustment is putting it back slightly differently. I'll give you a slightly different example. I used to sit next to a maintenance manager, and what he used to do, what I managed to convince him to do, was every time you do a street and relay all the footways down there, you've got all the drop curbs at the side streets. At the very, very minimum, you should be putting in flush curbs and buff tactile paving as your absolute minimum level of service, if you like. Went through it, explained why, he got it, and he and I have long since departed that authority, and that's exactly what they do to this day. That's kind of got into the DNA of the local authority somehow. It was written down and put in policies. That's how you deal with it. So if your council's maintenance team are saying, no, we're going to go back and just put back rubbish, you can say, well, you really need to go and look at the Equality Act, get your legal people to give you some advice on that. The problem is, it would be somebody with a protected characteristic that have to basically sue them to get them to change. That's the problem. But it doesn't cost a penny to put it back correctly. No reason at all.
Yeah. Okay.
Really good question, that one.
Ideally, we want to get that through council policy so it becomes the norm rather than fighting this street by street. But where are they going to find the money? All right. Another question again here. How do we get our local authorities to make our streets nicer? Are there pros and cons of tarmac versus slabs in delivering, or I guess for both the curb and then pavement more generally?
Yeah, I mean, it's difficult really, because a lot of local authorities, I would say most of the maintenance people are pretty skint at the moment. They have been for some time. There is a perception that asphalt is easy to put in, it's easy to maintain because you can just repair cracks, cut sections out and relay it, just slap some more in at the time. The problem with that is, of course, every time you do a repair, you're digging stuff out, you're throwing it away, you're bringing new in. I am a massive fan of, whether it's block paving, whether it's flag slabs, call it what you like. If they're large slabs, they're the ones that tend to get broken up by people overrunning the footway. So from a maintenance point of view, they're out of favour, unfortunately. You can use high strength sort of small versions or go down to block paving, as the Dutch use absolutely everywhere. The only thing with block paving is, like any surface, it does degrade. It needs to be maintained, lifted up and replaced every so often. And some people find it a bit uncomfortable to go across if it's not laid properly. Personally, if I was in charge of the maintenance department, I would convert everything to block paving. So much easier to deal with. It really is. But there you go. It's fashions and fads, unfortunately. And at the moment, tarmac is seen as cheap and easy.
Yeah. I guess that from where I'm originally from, it's concrete for all the pavements, poured concrete. So I mean,
we used to do it. You go back to the 30s, the UK, probably the 30s to the 50s. Yeah, everything was concrete, roads, pavements. The only other one that you do see a lot in the Netherlands is the clay blocks, the little skinny clay blocks. They have a design life of something like 150 years, because you wear them out after 70 years, you pick them up, turn them over and put them back down again, which is really sustainable. So yeah, I don't know why we don't.
And it's an absolute art form. There's an article all about the art of Dutch bricklaying, and I've had the privilege of, weirdly, of being able to watch Dutch bricklayers at work, renovating the road. But it means if there's maintenance, you pull the bricks up, you do what you need, you put the bricks back down, and it's not needing patching. If you get a bit of a dip, just fix it.
Well, I had an inquiry from a developer who wanted to convince the local authority this is what they wanted to use, the actual Dutch bricks. The local authority wanted a detailed sort of appreciation of the maintenance regime. I asked European colleagues, and they kind of shrugged their shoulders and said, well, you just sweep it occasionally and relay them every so often, and what do you need beyond that? And this is the problem. It's go and see it and speak to people thing. But I've just seen the question pop up about quality block paving. I can lay block paving. I was taught many years ago, because I was bored on site and I was supervising a project, and they said, come and have a go. So it's all in the preparation as anything. We have got people that lay it if they do it properly. There's no reason why we can't do Dutch quality surfacing in this country of any description. It's just we skimp and don't supervise and all the rest of it.
Genuinely appreciate it as an art form, but it helps you get all the right falls, so you don't get water pooling, and you can do so much there. One of my weird interests. Okay, another question. You hear people talk about services being damaged by driving on the footway. Does consideration have to be made towards how far down the services are before a driveway access is approved? Or is this not?
Ooh, that's another really good question. In theory, yes. In practice, probably not, unless you've got maybe you've got a lid in the footway that's not driveway strength. So telecom, for example, they tend to have sort of lighter loaded versions and heavier duty versions if you put just like a domestic drop curb in. I mean, practically most utilities probably are down at the right level for a footway, just for a footway crossing. But it can come back to bite if you haven't thought about it as a local authority, for sure.
Yeah, brilliant. Okay, have we got any more questions? Anyone else want to sit here and talk for half an hour about Dutch block paving? Clay
Go on for
paving?
hours. Could we look at lots of photos next time?
Well, I'm back in the Netherlands in June, so I'll be stocking up with. They even have a machine that does their paving for them, automates.
They
it.
do, yeah.
Phenomenal.
Yeah.
And they fix the utilities underneath before they pave it. Okay, well, I think we're done. I'm going to call it and go and capture a bit more of the sunshine before it goes. So a big thank you, everybody, for joining us today. Looking forward to seeing you next week. I should probably tell you who we've got in the diary for next week, if you give me just a second. Next week, we have got Jason Prince, CEO of the Urban Transport Group, sharing news from the Urban Transport Group. So we'll have to wait until next week to find out what that news is.